We know we have one. I know.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. Thanks for being here this morning. A little bit easier time getting here this morning, I hope, than last week. I see lots of people decided to leave extra early just to make sure there wasn't any problem on the way here. So we're glad that you're here this morning. Let's start off by singing together. Let's warm up. Hymn number 62. This is a song that we sang last year when we were talking about Joshua and entering the promised land. And there's a particular line in here that is, I think, important, but it's often misunderstood or not understood at all. It says, "Here I raise my Ebenezer." And you all know what an Ebenezer is. It's one of those standing stone markers, exactly, that helps us that commemorates what the Lord has done. So because we're going to be talking about some of the same turf and some of the same history today, I thought this would be a great one for us to sing. So let's all stand together and sing hymn number 62, "Come Thou Fount." Here I raise my Intervals and wind sprints, maybe a little strength conditioning. That's good stuff. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for giving us this time together today. Lord, we are a people whose hearts are prone to wander. We are a people who need to be reminded of your goodness in our lives. We need those Ebenezers, whether they be literal stone markers or whether they be just reminders that come daily to us. But we need those reminders of your grace, your power, and of your majesty. Now, Lord, we just ask that as we turn to your word, you would help us to remember that we, like your people throughout history, have wandered, but we are found. That we were lost, but that you sought us. And you sought us even when we were strangers. Now, Lord, turn us to your word, empower us, enlighten our hearts, and inspire us with your grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, it is good to see everybody this morning. First of all, I've got a couple things I want to mention. First of all, I want to thank everybody for just the wonderful participation in our Global Missions Weekend last weekend. It was wonderful to have the church gathered together to talk about the different ways that we are partnering with people around the world to minister to different cultures and things like that. You know, that goes right along with this, not only the topic of witness that we've been studying in the book of Acts, but also it goes right along with what we've been studying in terms of learning about the cultures and context in which the Word of God speaks. And so it's great to be able to be here to celebrate local missions with friends from Mission India, friends from Poland, just all these special events. So thank you all for being here for that. But at the same time, I also want to remind everybody that in just a couple of weeks, not this weekend, but next weekend, we're going to be holding our Love SATS event, which is our local missions outreach. It's a local mission celebration. And on Saturday morning, the 22nd, we're going to be spread out all over the city, visiting, working with our partners. I would say more in introductions and in relationship building than in any specific project, but there will be plenty to do. We will do a lot of great, meaningful things. But it's going to be a chance to expose us to different mission partners around the city. And then we're going to all come back together at Chris Madrid's to have a hamburger and just celebrate what God is doing in the city. So I want you to just go ahead and think about a ministry that you'd like to sign up with and work with on that Saturday morning. And just think about it as a great time of celebration for the church. We still need about 200 volunteers, so don't worry, there's slots available for you. But we hope that you come and get connected with Morningside Ministries or Mission Road or PCHAS or with SA Eagles or one of our other many partners that we're going to be working with on that Saturday morning. So please look for the sign-up table down in Mosaic Lobby and also just other places around the church. Now, so as we turn today to our study of the context and cultures of the Bible on location, I wanted to share with you all a resource that has been very helpful for me. You should have with your materials this morning this sheet of paper that says archaeological periods. This is actually from a book, a reference book that I use a lot, and it's just a book full of helpful Bible charts and maps and things like that. And this is one of the pages that I first dog-eared, and then I put a bookmark in it. And I just realized I go to it just about every week, just so that I can sort of orient myself with the times and the seasons or the epochs of the various biblical stories that we're dealing with. I mean, just like a map helps us to understand the geographic location of the things that are happening that we're reading about, that we're talking about. A timeline It helps us to understand where these things occurred in time relative to other things that were happening in the world. Now, archaeologists tend to group different time periods under categories of technology. For example, the Stone Age, when the predominance of stone or of tools were made out of stone and things like that. The Bronze Age, when metal tools began to work their way into common use in everyday life. And then the Iron Age, which is another transition in that type of technology. And we see throughout history that there are certain times and certain points of evolution in the civilization when a technology will really sort of reshape the landscape. You might say that now we're in the Silicon Age because of all the technology related to computers and smartphones and everything like that. But what we have here is kind of the basic breakdown of the biblical ages. And of course, at the end of this sheet, you see the third period of the Iron Age, was called the Iron Age. After that, you have the Greeks and the Romans. With the Greeks and the Romans and that Persian age, you start to be able to get a little bit more consistent in your dating. And what I mean by that is we begin to have a little bit more clarity about when things happen connected to other civilizations. When we're talking about the patriarchs, and we're talking about Noah, and we're talking about the conquest, and we're talking about the Exodus, those, we know within reason, within centuries when that happened, but there's always dispute among scholars because if you find an arrowhead in the ground, it usually doesn't come with a date attached to it. You just have to kind of try and figure out, okay, these were being used and invented by these people at this time, and you have to just kind of figure out when that thing might have been used. You also have to guess, well, was it buried? Was this dropped and therefore the dirt covered it and everything's in good order? Or was it buried and it messed up the whole archaeological record? All that to say, this is sort of an inexact science. And you also have to be very careful that you don't take, say, for example, this archaeological record or this archaeological scheme and impose it, say, for example, on Latin America, on Mesoamerican schemes, because while the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayans were very sophisticated cultures, they did not have iron tools and weapons until Europeans got here. And so to say that they were less sophisticated than the Babylonians because they didn't have Bronze Age tools is really to misunderstand. They were still using largely stone tools. So by this definition, they were still in the Stone Age, but we know that they were much more advanced civilizations than that. So you can't take this and just overlay it across all history, but for Middle Eastern and for European history, this is a pretty good marker. And so this is just a tool to help you kind of get an idea of how archaeologists date these things, how they group these things. If you read in one place that the Exodus took place in 1296 and another place that it took place in 14-something BC, don't get freaked out by that. I mean, yes, that's a 200-year window, but what's even less accurate is like carbon dating. Carbon dating puts you within a few centuries, not just 1 or 2 centuries. So again, the exact time period is a little bit of guesswork, but this should help you have an idea of what's going on. So today we're really kind of at this. If you look on here, you see the Neolithic or Stone Age periods. Then you've got the Bronze Age, early Bronze, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The Middle Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age. Today we're talking about the Late Bronze Age and kind of moving into what would be called the Early Iron Age, because this is a very important period. Why the Iron Age? You remember last week that Jonathan King talked about the Hittites, and it was really the Hittites that began to develop the use of iron for weapons and everyday tools. We'll talk a lot more about that next week, because especially when we're talking about the Philistines, that's going to come into play quite a bit. But it is fascinating that really the Hittites and their influence, that was of course picked up by others, that's what initiated the Iron Age. It also brought to an end many of the old powers of the Bronze Age. Why is that? Because if you are an Iron Age army fighting with iron weapons versus a Bronze Age army fighting with bronze weapons, who's going to win? an iron sword cuts right through a bronze sword. And so suddenly you've got a disadvantage. You don't have the advantage of better wheels for your chariots, better weapons, better tools for building, all of those sorts of things. So these are really important. One interesting little bit of trivia, though, is that the only other people who had iron before the Iron Age were the Egyptians. But the Egyptians got it from a very interesting source. The Egyptians, being great astronomers, great astrologers, were always watching the sky. And what do you do if you watch the sky? Eventually you're going to see meteors, and if you track them every now and then, you'll see where they land. And they would send out expeditions to go get those meteors. And what did they find in the meteors? Iron ore. And so we have in Egyptian records that occasionally a pharaoh would have a dagger or something small made out of star metal. That was usually iron ore from a meteorite. And or actually 100% of the time it was iron ore from a meteorite. But that has also led into the whole fun conspiracy sci-fi theory that, maybe it was you read in Egyptian records that these pharaohs had star metal, and that's like, obviously that's who built the pyramids. It was aliens. But there really is there's always just a little grain of truth to even the weirdest rumors. But that's the real transition that we're talking about today. We're moving from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And what was happening at the beginning of the Iron Age? A couple weeks ago, we talked about the Egyptian culture, talked about the Exodus. Well, what happened 40 years after the Exodus? 40 years after the Exodus, the children of Israel are poised on the edge of the Promised Land. Now, they've been here before, 40 years earlier, right after they came out of Egypt. What happened? They came to the edge of the Promised Land. They were here. I'm sorry. I've got too many maps involved today. This one's hard to see. This one's really poorly drawn, but I'm going to step over to this one. The Israelites came out of Egypt, and they came over here across the Sinai Peninsula, and they came initially to right up here to the edge of the Promised Land, and they came to a place called Kadesh Barnea. What happened in Kadesh Barnea? They sent spies into the land, and what did the spies discover? Well, first of all, they described the land as what? It was a land flowing with milk and honey. Beautiful crops, grapes the size of basketballs. But what else was there? Giants. The Anakim. This group of people they described as giants in the land, and the cities were huge and well fortified. All this stuff, all these things were true. They actually do have historical precedent for this. But they were so intimidated because they thought that the people of the land were so big that they made them feel like grasshoppers. And so what did they do? They lost heart. And everybody but Caleb and Joshua, of the 12 spies who went, these were the only two who said, no, we've got God on our side. We can go. We can take the land that he's promised. But the other 10 said, no, we're just going to go in there and they're going to slaughter us. And so what did God do? God said, you aren't ready to go? I'm not ready for you to go. I'm going to keep my covenant. Remember what Jonathan talked about last week? I'm going to keep my covenant with the children of Israel, but not with this generation of you. Israel will get the promised land. I will be faithful to my covenant, but you don't get to live there. And so why did the children of Israel wander in the desert for 40 years? They were biding the time. Waiting for what? For the whole generation to die out. Now they were not just sitting on their hands. There was a lot going on during that time. We studied that last year as we studied the wilderness period. We studied the book of Numbers. We studied the conquest of Joshua. So a lot of this, if you were here last year, you will remember a lot of this stuff from last year. But they spent that time on the edge of the wilderness. And what was happening in the world situation at this time? Well, Werner Keller, the German scholar that I've been quoting quite a bit, says this. He says, about the same time as Israel was standing by the Jordan, after the 40 years, as they were standing by the Jordan, getting ready to invade the promised land, ready to march in, fate was advancing upon the Mediterranean. Troy and the days of the proud stronghold of King Priam were numbered. Soon the Homeric heroes of Greece, Achilles, Agamemnon, and Odysseus, would be arming for the fray. The hands of the timepiece of history were moving towards 1200 BC, and Israel could not have chosen a better time for invasion. What is he saying? He's saying that by the time the Israelites got to the edge of Jordan, there was a tremendous cultural and political revolution taking place all over the Mediterranean basin. I mean, this is the period of the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is the period when the great movements of Greece and the great civilizations of Anatolia or Turkey, like Troy, were vying for power. You remember at this time, Turkey was much more Greek than it was Asian. And so you have this power struggle. You have great movements of people across the Mediterranean, not only on the seaside, but also on the land side. So in the past, where we've always looked at the movements coming from the east, from Mesopotamia, now you've got this huge influx of people coming in from the north, from Greece and Turkey on the land side, and also across the Mediterranean. And there's a lot of difficulty. Egypt was still strong enough to defend itself, but it was not really strong enough to push back this kind of movement, this great migration or invasion of other peoples coming from the north and from the west. Now, at the same time, Israel, having left Egypt, was coming up to Canaan from the east. And as Verner Keller says, there could not have better time to come and invade Canaan. Because he says this, ever since the expulsion of the Hyksos, who were the Hyksos? Those were the Semitic people who had taken over Egypt for a while and who welcomed Joseph as a vizier. Ever since the expulsion of the Hyksos about 1550 BC, Palestine had been an Egyptian province. Under the Hyksos, a feudal system had broken up the old patriarchal social structure as it had existed in Abraham's day. And what had replaced it was a feudal aristocratic ruling class, which was self-centered and was territorial and largely foreign. So instead of being strong family units and tribal units all over Canaan, you had this sort of network of feudal lords that had been imposed by the Egyptians. The Egyptians didn't really care what happened in Canaan, as long as Canaan paid its tributes to the empire, to Pharaoh. And so they could do whatever they wanted. And so as long as they paid their tributes, you had these local kings, these local chieftains, these local warlords who arose in power, who built castles. This is the fortified cities that the Israelites saw. And from there, they either projected power or were overrun by others. But what happened during this time between Joseph and Moses, in that 400 years, what was happening over here in Canaan was that Egypt had been bleeding them dry. And so what had been a Hyksos and a Semite stronghold had really sort of devolved into a balkanized region of city-states. They were not united. Some of them were strong. Most of them were there was constant battle. They were always in conflict with one another, but there was no united front. And so by the time Joshua arrived on the borders of Canaan, it was a territory just ripe for the picking. And so one of the things that Verner Keller says is this: under Ramses II, Egypt had indeed known its last period of glory, during which it had consolidated power in Palestine. But now even the might of Egypt crumbled in the political upheavals which marked the transition between the Bronze and Iron Ages. Why didn't Egypt try to defend its Palestinian holdings here in Israel? I mean, again, it's been 40 years. Ramses II, the pharaoh who was embarrassed by Moses, has actually had a pretty good run. He's been doing okay over here in Egypt. But why didn't they try to reassert themselves here in Palestine? Well, it's because you had a big movement of people, loosely called by history the Sea Peoples, who were coming down from Greece, from the Minoan civilizations from places like Crete, the Mycenaeans, the Phoenicians, who had noticed that Egypt was there for the pickings. It had food, it had treasure, and they were starting to come in and take an interest. Egypt was able to successfully defend itself, but it had to focus all of its energy on just defending itself, leaving the door open here. Now, people might say, oh, so that's why this happened. It didn't have anything to do with God at all. Of course it did. God in his providence is opening the way for Israel to come into Canaan. As surely as he parted the Red Sea, as surely as he stopped the waters of the Jordan, he shifted all of Egypt's attention to the west. That's pretty impressive. And the skeptic would say, well, these things just happen coincidentally. No. We know that they happen because of the providence of God. So God is moving the pieces on the chessboard so that Israel can claim the promised land. So that's where we are right now. So let's talk about that movement into the promised land, because it was not just a walk-in type of thing. You remember that when Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, he then rose up to power, and then he brought his family to Egypt for the sake of their own health and protection. Who was his family? Who was Joseph's father? Jacob, right. Jacob at one point got a new name, like a lot of people in the Bible do. What was his new name? Israel, that's right. And so, if all of Jacob's children came into Egypt, who came into Egypt with him? They were what would they be called at that point? If they're the children of Jacob, they are also the children of Israel. Okay, great. So, who stayed home? It's only the family of Jacob, relative to our story today, that came to Egypt. Did Abraham, well, first of all, were there any other family members who might have stayed in Canaan? Absolutely. For example, Abraham, through his wife Keturah, had a bunch of other sons. Among them, sons like Midian. The Midianites, you've heard of them. They were already an established people group by the time Joseph was sold into slavery. There were others, maybe that we don't remember as well. But there were other groups in this area that were still in the promised land. And I like to think of these as the kind of the cousins of Israel. Still children of Abraham or cousins to Abraham, but they were the ones who stayed. So we don't necessarily recognize this until we dig back into the genealogies. But as Israel was coming to Canaan, they kept meeting these cousins all over Israel. And say we have a sound problem? Okay, good. All right. They kept coming. They kept meeting their cousins. So who were the cousins that they met on the way to Israel? Well, the first, if you look here, they first came to the land of Edom, which is right here on the bigger map. And you hear about the Edomites all the time. Who were the Edomites? Well, the Edomites were, according to Genesis 36:1, the children of Esau. Who was Esau? Son of Jacob. Excuse me, son of Isaac, brother of Jacob. So he's never going to be an Israelite, right? But he's still a descendant of Abraham. Not part of the covenant line, but still a cousin, still related. Okay? And now, this is Esau. I love this picture of Esau. This is kind of just a contemporary rendition of Esau. What do you notice about Esau? What's interesting about the coloring? Red, exactly. The Bible describes Esau as ruddy. What does that mean? He was a redhead. We don't think about it, but the ancient Jews were actually redheads. That was something that we hear. Not all of them, obviously, but there was a strong, sort of strong gene apparently for them. But the ancient Hebrews had this sort of ruddy look, and it says that he was ruddy. But Edom is also the land of Edom is also it's right here, is also kind of saturated, permeated by red sandstone. It's mostly red sandstone. How many of you have ever traveled to the Holy Land and ever been to this place here? It's called Petra. Petra is in the country of Jordan, but it is in a part of Jordan that was once the land of Edom. And every picture I've ever seen of Petra, it's red. Yeah, it looks red. Have you ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? It's in that. It's this red cut sandstone. Kind of think of it like when you drive. If you drive north of Dallas, you cross the Red River into Oklahoma. All of a sudden, what happens? Everything turns red. The dirt's red. The water's red. Everything's red. You go to the University of Oklahoma. The bricks are all red. I mean, there's this just red dirt everywhere. I mean, South Carolina, it's all red clay. It's actually better than Oklahoma. But Edom means red. It's kind of the land of the red, the land of Esau. So you have this connection. Now, the Edomites show up again and again, even up until like the book of Isaiah. Why? Because the Edomites are remembered as the cousins who don't help. So imagine that you're in dire straits. You're coming into town, and you call up your cousins. You say, "Hey, I'm in town. Can we get together for dinner?" And they say, "No, we don't want to see you." Why do we not want to see you? Well, because you guys are the ones who stole our birthright. Now we know the story from Jacob's perspective that Esau was a fool and he sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. And Jacob was the favorite child of Isaac. But how do you think the Edomites told that story? Jacob was a jerk. He stole our ancestors' inheritance. And so there was, they were cousins, but there was not a lot of closeness between the Israelites, the sons of Jacob, and the sons of Esau. And so you see in Isaiah and in Jeremiah and places like that where Edom is sort of exclusively held out for what they don't do for Israel. At a time, there are times when Edom could have helped Israel, and it didn't. So there's this animosity between the Edomites and the Israelites. But they weren't the only cousins that they met. Who else did they meet? Well, they also met the Moabites. Now, who were the Moabites? The Moabites and the Ammonites were, again, cousins to the Israelites, but they were not direct line cousins. They were not quite as close because the Moabites and the Ammonites were not descendants of Abraham. They had a common ancestor with Abraham in Terah, but who were the Moabites and the Ammonites descended from? From Lot. That's right. You remember Lot is the patron saint of bad decisions in the Old Testament. He's the one who, Moses gave him his choice of any land of the two of them. He said, "You can have any of this land that you want." What part did Lot choose? He chose the best part, which was the part closest to Sodom and Gomorrah. Bad idea. He was conquered, and then eventually Sodom and Gomorrah were laid waste by God, and what happened to his wife? Here. Yeah. She turned, when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, she turned around to look, not because she was curious, but because her heart was still attached to Sodom and Gomorrah. She was still deeply connected to them. And she kind of moved into Sodom and sort of bought into the whole thing. And when they left, she just couldn't. So she turned into a pillar of salt. Well, so who did escape with Lot? His two daughters. Who didn't escape? Their husbands. And so what we find is that they get Lot drunk one night, and because they can't have children with their former husbands and there are no other men of their tribe around, they decide to go in with Lot. And they seduce him, and they get pregnant. And they bear two sons, and their names are Moab and Ben-Ami, who become the eponymous ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites. So the Moabites and the Ammonites are, again, cousins to the Israelites, but they are children of a curse. not part of the line of Abraham, but still related through the line of Terah. So who were the Moabites? The Moabites are, we hear a lot more about them than we do about the Ammonites. But the Moabites occupied this ground here, kind of next to the Dead Sea. And now I will say, they were up on the plateau where there was actually fertile ground. It wasn't down in the Dead Sea plain, but they were up in this area. But they occupied this area called the Flames of Moab. And it's interesting that that throughout the book of really Numbers and Deuteronomy, and even into Joshua, from basically Numbers chapter 22 through the book of Joshua, the people of Israel are living in Moab. They were there long enough that it became a problem. They were there long enough that the people of Moab started to have a tremendous negative influence on the people. Now, what about the Moabites? Well, the Moabites did have a civilization. This is called the Meshe Stela, which is actually a Moabite record of their own history, not a biblical record. But they actually did have a history. They became a sort of a civilization. They were never a mighty civilization, and basically they were kind of a blend of the Canaanite cultures and also the Mesopotamian cultures. But they did, even though they did, to some degree, give the passing nod to El, the god of the Hebrews. They also brought in every other god they could get their hands on as well. They were Baal worshipers. You remember Baal, who is that fertility god that the Canaanites love so much. He was not a kind of a big universal god like El was, or like Yahweh is, but he was kind of that local god. He was he was the god that everybody worships El, but everybody loves Baal, because he's the one to make sure my crops are going. He's the one to make sure that my groves are produced. He's the one to make sure that my cattle are having offspring, along with his consort Ashtaroth, Astarte. So he had his consort, but of course the main god and the sort of the prime god who emerged as the chief of the Moabite pantheon was this guy who we know by several different names, Molech, or Melech, or as the Moabites called him, Chemosh. And Chemosh was, again, that blood god. Same god as Molech. Same god as Melech. He is that god who requires human blood for whatever it is you want from him. He is a war god. He is a god of death. But he is also a god of strength. Now, what was the attraction? Why would people worship gods like this? Why would they create gods like this? They create gods like this because because of our brokenness and sinfulness. We have a violent streak in us, and we associate violence and power. And so if violence equals power, then there must be a God up there who is really powerful because he's really violent. If we can get him on our side, well, guess what? Then we can rule over everybody else. He'll help us get the things we want, as long as we give him what he wants. And what does Chemosh want? He wants blood. But not the blood of old goats like me. He wants the blood of pure children, of the innocent, of the righteous, of the people who do not deserve to die. Don't go sacrificing Chemosh to criminals. You don't care about them. They don't, and it's not because he won't accept their blood. It's because they don't mean anything to you. If you're gonna get something from him, it's gonna cost you something. And so Chemosh, was really the chief god of the Moabite pantheon. And what we see in the book of Numbers is that while the Israelites are living in the plains of Moab, they begin to mix with the Moabites, even to the point of participating in these ritual sacrifices. They buy into this religion, which is why Phineas and why Moses and everybody else goes so bananas about the intermarriage and mingling with the Moabites. It's not because they decided, it's not because I grew up Presbyterian and all of a sudden my kid wants to go to the Baptist church. It's because we grew up Christian, and now my children are sacrificing their children in the fire to this pagan god. I mean, I think that, unfortunately, our culture sanitizes so much of history, and all of us, we all went to Sunday school classes where things were smoothed over so they wouldn't be offensive, so we get the basic gist of the story. Sometimes you need more than the basic gist of the story. Sometimes you need the details, because those details will scare you straight. So, this is the Moabites. Who are the Ammonites? The Ammonites we don't hear as much about, but really basically the same people. Their chief god was Shamash as well. This is roughly where they were located. We don't really hear as much about the Ammonites, except sometimes scholars believe that sometimes the word Amorite and the word Ammonite were sometimes confused. It really doesn't matter. They were a pagan people who were constantly a thorn in Israel's side. You see them. You see David fighting them. You see Saul fighting them. You see others fighting them. They're mentioned in other places. Because the Moabites we hear so much about because the Israelites lived in the plains of Moab. Ammonites, they never really got up there, but that's why. Again, these are cousins that were just a constant problem for the Israel. And so we have all these cousins that they are having to deal with. Again, it's interesting that we actually have testimony from the Moabites and the Ammonites about who they were themselves. King Mesha, the one who carved this stela. In this stela, one of the things he does is he is entreating the god Chemosh for victory against his enemies. And for that sake of that victory, he's bragging about the fact that he sacrificed his own child to achieve this victory. Not, I had to, and I'm so sorry, this is what it cost me, this was my sacrifice. But heck, I would have done this 10 times ago if I'd known. So again, we see that this is not a culture that is gentle and benign and pastoral. These are, by their own words, pretty scary people. So again, this is the Moabite, Ammonite, and Edomite cultures that they passed through. But again, here's Joshua, and the people are standing on the edge of the promised land. So they're finally here, and Joshua 1 through 3, we read this. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving to them and the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will step on, I've given you just as I promised to Moses. This is the beginning of the book of Joshua. And so what we see next from that is, the next big event is
I'm Siri. Choose the voice you'd like me to use.
And then the Battle of Jericho. And I talked a lot about the crossing of the Jordan and the Battle of Jericho last year, and so I'm not going to go into all of the theological implications of that, but I do want to mention some things about Jericho. First of all, it says Joshua 6 says this: "And it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city, and they burnt the city with fire, and all that was therein." Now, Jericho, of course, is an actual place. It's called now Tel Es-Sultan, and it is one of the most active archaeological sites in the Holy Land. And what has been found is remains all the way to Stone Age settlements, all the way through contemporary history. But one of the things that they discovered is that the city of Jericho has been wiped out and rebuilt about 17 times. Why? Well, because if you look at if I brought back my little topographical map of the ancient Near East, Jericho is the gateway to Canaan. Because you've got Dead Sea on this side, you've got the mountains over here, you've got this big plateau, fertile plateau here, and Jericho is the easiest way for armies from the west to get into Canaan. And so it became sort of the doorway, the gateway to Canaan. And so yes, the Israelites conquered it, but before that, other people had been conquering Jericho for a while. Why do you think they kept building the walls back? And I imagine that by the time Joshua got there, they figured, okay, the 17 is the charm. We know what we're doing now, and there is no human force that will ever be able to tear down these walls. And then who did they meet? The Lord of hosts. They met the commander of the army of God, who then told Joshua and his people, you're going to have to attack this city in a supernatural way, not in the way that we did and that was done in the past. But just speaking about Jericho archaeologically, Kathleen Kenyon, who was one of the early archaeologists for Jericho, said that Jericho can lay claim to being by far the oldest city in the world. There is evidence of human settlement in Jericho going back over 7,000 years. Just incredible. I mean, now when I say evidence, I mean I'm talking about stone circles that, interestingly, stone circles that were the foundations of houses that resemble sort of the idea of a Bedouin tent. So a Bedouin tent people, nomadic people, decided to settle there, and so they're, first houses they're building. How do you build them? Build them like the tent you've always lived in. And then they found, they would find tools and pottery shards and things like that. But they found layer after layer of civilization in this place. And, time and time again, they had found that the walls have come tumbling down. So we do find this. We do find that this city, it's still there today, and it has been conquered over and over again, including by the Israelites. That happened around 1200 BC. After that, they of course began to move up into Israel itself, and we read last year about Joshua and the people then dividing the land or assigning different portions of the land to the different tribes of Israel. And you have some tribes that asked if they could settle on the eastern side of the Jordan River. You've got Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh that decided to settle on this side of the river because, again, this was a very fertile area. You remember, what's over here? So here's Israel. What's over here? It's the country of Jordan now, but what is it? Well, I mean, not politically, what is it? This is desert. You always see the picture of the Fertile Crescent coming from Mesopotamia up through like Syria and down into the Holy Land. Why is that? Because between here and Mesopotamia is desert. Y'all remember Lawrence of Arabia? When they're crossing that desert, from where are they crossing from? They're crossing from I believe it's like Baghdad or someplace like that over to Palestine. And you have this, or I can't remember which way it is they're going, but they're crossing that desert, also known as the Anvil of the sun. It was not a common trade route because it was just too brutal. But this was, for people coming in from, sometimes people would invade from the north, sometimes they would invade from the east. And if they did, this is how they came in. So we talked a lot last year about Joshua and the conquest of the Holy Land. But what I'd like to spend a little bit of time this morning discussing is the book of Judges. Because the book of Judges gives us a really interesting capsule of life in ancient Canaan. So just to begin with, Judges 2, 7, and 8. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years. I have a friend who just retired at 53. Joshua worked till he was 110 years old. I'm feeling like, okay, I don't want to work till I'm 110. I love y'all, But I'm going to retire before I get 110. 110 years old. What happened then in Judges chapter 2? What happened after Joshua died? Well, Judges 2, beginning in verse 11. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. What happened between verse 8 and verse 11? It says that they forgot about Joshua and his generation, Moses and his generation, and what the Lord had done for them. So the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. And they abandoned the Lord, and they served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. I mean, within a generation of Joshua's death, they were already reverting to the very things that God had tried to pull them away from. Judges 2, 14 through 16 continues with this. And so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And again, God said, if you do what I tell you to do, I will take care of you. If you don't, I'm going to release my protection from you. Therefore, God fulfilled his covenant, and when they didn't do what they were supposed to do, he released his protection, and they were plundered. And suddenly all these people that they had been conquering and beating and defeating all turned on them. Or at least the ones who had survived all turned on them. But what did the Lord do? Did he abandon the people completely? No. Verse 16 of Judges 2 says this. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of those who plundered them. The book of Judges gives us a really interesting, almost core sample of ancient Canaanite, Israelite culture in Canaan at the beginning of the Iron Age. Now let's talk about what was going on in Canaan at the time. Because we are looking at this, where the good guys are the Jews, the good guys are the people of Israel, the good guys are the people of God, we just assume that when the people of Israel came into Canaan, they came into this dystopian hellscape of burned out buildings, kind of like London after the Blitz, like where it's the Wild West, everybody's just killing everybody, and there's it's just like I don't know, like downtown Portland right now or something like that. It's just poverty, destruction everywhere. That's not the way Canaan was. Canaan was actually a very beautiful and prosperous place. If you have the ESV Study Bible, this is actually a note from that. It says that the major problem for Israel during the period of the Judges was its penchant for turning away from the Lord and towards the gods of the Canaanites. Now, why would they do that? Because the land of Canaan was awe-inspiring to the Israelites. And you can see that in the story of the spies who go to look at the land in Numbers 13. They did not say that Canaan is hell on earth. What did they say? It's beautiful. Crops, olives, grapes, milk and honey. Cities that you would never believe. I mean, how would the great cities like Shechem or Jerusalem or even for their time, Jericho, how would those have looked to a generation of desert nomads who'd been living in tents their whole lives? I mean, it was unbelievable. It's like the first time Dorothy sees the Emerald City. It's unbelievable. And they started thinking, this ain't all bad. I mean, look at these guys. They're drinking beer, because that was a big thing. They're drinking beer. They've got vineyards. They've got olives. They've got sheep. They've got wheat. They've got fields. I mean, okay, yeah. God's given us food for every day for the last 40 years. He's given us the same manna every day, quail. We get a little tired of manna and quail. But no, he's given us food. We're not this and that. But look at this. This is awesome. I mean, sure, yeah, we've had tents to live in. That's pretty cool. But look at this city. Maybe these gods are worth something. Maybe these Baals and these Ashtoreths, maybe they're not all bad. And so they were seduced this freed slave people were seduced by the culture, by the bling of Canaanite society. Remember, this is the land of purple. This is the land of the Phoenicians, the land of the Hittites. They've got, horses. We're just donkey people. Look at that, they got horses. It's like a donkey 2.0. So they think it's amazing. The Canaanites were clearly superior to the Israelites on a lot of different levels. Art, architecture, trade, political organization, literature. It's not difficult to see how the Israelites would have been tempted by the elaborate Canaanite society, especially by its religious system. Oh, and by the way, when you go to church in Canaan, it involves doing what? It involves sex. What was the Hebrew religion was telling them? Abstain from the pleasures of the flesh. What was Canaanite religion telling them? That's how you go to church. For real. Cult prostitution was the main form of worship. The Israelites were not seduced by piety. Or rather, they were seduced by a piety that involved all of the things they were told were sinful. And so, it's like suddenly they're not going to church. They're not going to church in a church. They're going in a casino. They're going in this place that indulges every one of these basic lusts. And that became very, very tempting for them. And so they are, of course, seduced by all this. Now, one of the things I've included on your sheet is just a listing of the different judges. And the reason I include that listing is because I want you to see, that how this becomes sort of a profile of all of the inhabitants of Canaan and all the different people groups that the Israelites encountered just in the book of Judges. You've got Deborah, who she led the people against the Canaanites, and Deborah's really the first story where we realize that the get real sort of rated R version of the Bible. I often tell people, and I think it's almost bad the way we teach stories from the book of Judges in Sunday school. Like all of us remember the little felt board flannel graph thing, and little pictures and things like that, all this kind of stuff. I have often told Sunday school teachers that if you are teaching any stories from the book of Judges to children or youth, and you do not get a call from their parents enraged, you're teaching it wrong. Because Judges is not rated G. It is not rated PG. It is not PG-13. It's not even R. It is full-on NC-17, TVMA, Game of Thrones blush-worthy. It is as bad as it gets. How does Deborah kill the Canaanite king, Sisera? She puts a tent stake through his head while he's asleep. I haven't seen a VeggieTales about that one yet, which is good. I don't want to do that. But throughout we see that God raised up these heroes who were as brutal as the people that they were protecting against, and yet they were faithful to God. Who else came after that? There are all kinds of cool glimpses in the book of Judges about the culture of this time. For example, Barak, who was the friend of Deborah, who also helped to fight the Canaanites, but also it was particularly the Canaanites that he helped to fight. What was special about Barak? He was the first Israelite leader to beat chariots in open battle, which was a game changer for the Israelites. Up till this time, they'd had to stick to the hill country, because as soon as they came down into the plains, the Canaanites and their chariots, which were a much more sophisticated military system, were able to wipe them out. A chariot and an archer can do a lot of damage against people who were just foot soldiers, especially lightly armed and armored foot soldiers. But it was Barak who led them against their first victory. How about Gideon? And what do we learn from the story of Gideon? Just about more than just faith. The cool thing about Gideon is we learned that you can do an awful lot with a small, dedicated group of hardcore believers, even more than you can with a big group of sort of nominal believers. Because what we see in the story of Gideon is what? That God takes the big army and whittles it down to the faithful. And then proves that it's his power that wins every battle. I mean, he takes he goes from the sort of the grand group of amateurs to the commandos. Just, this is what I can do when you trust me, with just people who are really dedicated. So this is, we need to not be embarrassed about it. I think it's really cool. But he also develops guerrilla tactics. They attack at night. But one of the things that's really interesting about the story of Gideon is that it introduces something that we sort of take for granted because of Hollywood. This is when it's actually in the book of it's actually in this battle of Gideon that camels are introduced as a weapon system, if you will. It is because who is Gideon fighting? He's fighting the Midianites. Who are the Midianites? Again, cousins of the Hebrews. Where do the Midianites come from? From Sinai. The camel was not domesticated until the late Bronze Age. But can you imagine? Can you imagine if you show up for battle and all of a sudden these people from the desert show up on this really big, weird-looking animal? That's going to throw you. And even if I don't know. Here you are charging in battle on your donkey against a camel. And that's just not fair. And I don't know if they were actually riding them into battle, fighting them from the top of the camel as a mount. But what could a camel do? Cross huge distances carrying huge loads. And so the Midianites could camp well out of sight and come in and attack from a long way away. But we don't even think about it because of Hollywood. Every time we see a Bible movie, they're camels, right? They didn't show up till now. Every scholar, liberal and conservative, believes that when the mention of camels in the story of Joseph is probably an anachronism. Meaning it was just one of the things that kind of fell into the story later, because like them later, it's like, oh, well, there had to be camels back then. But they weren't really around. They weren't domesticated. And so they're just little tidbits. And of course, Samson, who we'll talk about next week, is the one who really introduces us in a lot of ways to Philistine culture. That's what we're going to talk about next week. So don't miss next week. Next week's about the Philistines. I think this is one of the most interesting people groups of the ancient world. And it's one I think that most of us don't learn a lot about. We learn a lot about the Egyptians. We learn about the Hebrews. We learn about the Greeks. We learn about the Romans. We really don't learn about the Philistines, and yet we hear about them all the time in the Bible. Now, before we break up, I want to just mention one last thing. If you look at one of the references I gave you for your reading today was a story from chapter 17 and 18 of the book of Judges. And it's about this man Micah and his household. Micah was from the tribe of Ephraim. And it's really just kind of an interesting little snapshot of life in Israel, or life in Canaan, during the time of the Judges. And, there are no major battles. It doesn't have anybody that we remember ever doing anything great. As a matter of fact, all the people in the story are pretty horrible. But it really does kind of give us an interesting snapshot of what was going on and why there were problems in Israel. So let me just read this to you. It's chapter 17, beginning in verse 1. There was a man of the hill country there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke it in my ears, behold, the silver is with me." Okay, so what's the first thing we learned about Micah? He stole $1,100 from his mom. Not cool. This guy's already, from the get-go, nobody likes Micah. Okay? So, but he is, And he says, but I'm the one who stole it. And he gave the 1,100 pieces of silver back to his mother. And she said, I dedicate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a carved image and a metal image. Now, wait a minute. She's from the tribe of Ephraim. She's one of the people of Israel. These are Israelites. These are the people of God. But she, the son steals her money. And she says, okay, well, you gave it back to me. So you know what? Why don't we use it to make what? A couple of idols. Not just one idol. We're going to make 2 idols out of it. Why 2? Metal image and carved image. Why were there always 2 idols? A Baal and an Asherah. The god and his consort. That's the recipe for fertility. That's the recipe for prosperity. If you can't eat just one, you got to have your 2 gods. So Micah does it. And then he ordains his own son as a priest in his house shrine. Later in the story, we also discover that there's a wandering Levite priest. Now, who are the Levites? They're the tribe of Moses. These are supposed to be the guardians of the faith of Israel, either as priests or as the attendants of the temple and the tabernacle of the holy places. They're dispersed all over the country. Why? Because they don't get their own particular land, but rather they are dispersed throughout the country. So here he is. He's supposed to be one of those, kind of like a religion extension agent who's supposed to keep Israel faithful. But what does he do? He comes and he's hired because he's given a suit and a place to live. He becomes basically the priest for this man's little home pagan temple. And so he's got not only his Asherah and his Baal, he's also got, what else do they spend the money on? On a bunch of other household gods. So they've got their god to ward off the rats. They've got their god to make sure that the fire's hot. They've got their god just for good luck, the just in case god. They've got all their other little household gods that they just distribute around the house, around the property. I mean, this is a snapshot of utter syncretism. I mean, again, these are the people of Israel, and yet, what are they doing? They're buying in completely to the culture around them. And that's why this is the first place where we see this phrase in the book of Judges, which becomes really seminal to the whole book, which is, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, when people tell you that the Bible is irrelevant in our contemporary day and age, I challenge you to point them to this story. Because here is a person who is at least nominally one of the people of God, who has bought into all of the idols of their culture. Why? Because they'd rejected the authority of God. Who was the king of Israel at this point? This is before Saul, this is before David, this is before Solomon. Who was the king of Israel at this point? God. So to say that there is no king in Israel, if God is the king, then they're saying essentially we have utterly rejected the authority of Yahweh. Now he can hang around, but like El and the source, he's totally buried under the debris of his culture, of the culture. Now, here's the problem. This is a great snapshot of contemporary life, of contemporary plurality. Do we have, I'm not meaning to go from preaching to meddling here, but do we have any idols in our houses, in our lives? Do they drown out the one true God and His Word? Are we in any less danger than these folks? If you continue reading this story, it gets from bad to worse. And it just shows what happens to a culture that is totally disconnected and has totally rejected any sense of authority or sovereignty or holiness of God. And so this is the culture in which Israel was enmeshed for close to 400 years. That's after they were in Egypt.
This time of the judges is a time of deep darkness spiritually for the people. Now, there were, of course, the great moments of clarity. But think about the Samson story, kind of the climax of the book of Judges. When does Samson finally get his moment of clarity? After he's been captured, blinded, humbled. That's when he finally gets it. It's like, it's not about me. It's not about power. It's not about bling. It's not about all these other things. It's about God and his righteousness. And that's when he finally gets it, and that's when he gets his strength back. We had an interesting discussion in our Thursday morning Bible study this morning about whether or not the United States is a godly nation, is a righteous nation. And, people can debate that all the time. But one thing I will say is that our country, our world, whether it's our country or other countries, as long as we reject the authority of the living God, then it's anything goes. Because that's what we're saying. That's all this is saying, is that, hey, it's not necessarily that they've turned to Baal, because Baal's nothing. Baal's not real. It's that they've rejected the real God. And then it's anything goes. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So, why do we learn about the culture and contexts of the Bible? Because we're in it. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for opening our eyes. Make us like Samson, so dependent on you that we can finally see clearly. Lord, help us to understand that even though some of these stories in the book of Judges get pretty bleak, you're still there. You are still there with your people. You never leave them or forsake them. You are a God of covenant promise. And that as the story unfolds, you do reveal yourself. But Lord, help us to understand the real challenges, the moment-by-moment temptations that were faced by your people then, so that we will know how to face the moment-by-moment temptations that we face now. We ask you to inspire us, to guide us, and to hold us. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you very much. See y'all later. Can I introduce, before everybody leaves, I want to just introduce to you all some special friends. Over here with Irina are two of our special, precious friends from the College of Theology and Social Sciences in Warsaw, Poland. This is Piotr Nowak and his wife, Stasia Nowak, and he is the rector of that seminary, a mission partner of ours. He's going to be sharing with one of the small groups this morning. But I just want you all to welcome Piotr and Stasia, or Peter and Stasia, and just give them a warm welcome to our PBS studies. They are good friends, and I think they are this close to just becoming Texans. So, love y'all. Thank you very much.